Let her rip.
Okay, good evening and welcome to the Clifton Cultural Arts Center. A few of us were in this building about 12 years ago for an occasion when it was still a Cincinnati Public School. Since then the community's taken over and there's all kinds of great things that happen in this building, including this presentation tonight, Beyond the Dugout. I'm Joe Wilmers. I'm a friend of Jimmy Carter, our guest speaker for many years, since we were about 14 years old, I think, so that goes back a few years. Tonight, our host is Robert Fleischer, who does a little photography in town. And the program is being underwritten by Duke McGonigal, who is a house painter, and he is the number one on the Angie's list, I heard, of all time. The greatest house painter around, according to some quarters. So we thank Duke for his generous support tonight.
Can we have a round of applause?
Yeah, we can have a round of applause. And Jimmy is one of our good friends and a real character, and I use that in a loving way, and I love to be around characters, and Jimmy's right at the top of the list there. He has a lot of passions in life. He's always been passionate about sports and history, and he's also been passionate about his friends and his family, and he's going to bring a lot of that passion here tonight as far as his love of sports and the Reds and the old days at Crosley Field. So at this time, I'd like to introduce a great storyteller, Jimmy Carter.
Thank you, Joe. Thanks, everyone, for coming. And I am Jimmy Carter. I'm the ex-president. Oh, no, that's another person. It's another story, too. But we don't have time for that tonight. But, yes, I did work at Crosley Field in the scoreboard for many years. I started about the middle of June in 1966 and worked till the last pitch there, which is June 24th.
I had a quick question.
Yes.
How did you get so interested in sports?
Well, as you might expect, Bob, my dad was a big influence in that. And I want to talk a little bit about him for a while. My father actually played for Withrow High School in 1927, was on an undefeated football team, and actually did not go to college. Ironically, his sister, who was a Phi Beta Kappa out of Ohio State, had him as a biology student, and she failed him. He had a scholarship to college, but that didn't happen. He told me later that was the best thing that could ever happen to him because it taught him that there were no free rides in life, and he said he always graduated from the school of hard knocks. Out of high school, though, he did quite well, became a car salesman and a car dealer, and by the middle of the 1930s, he was in the Depression, he was one of the most successful businessmen in the city. He had 4 car dealerships. And interestingly, that was his first advent into sports in that he actually at that time helped sponsor a game which brought Satchel Paige and Dizzy Dean to Cincinnati. They had barnstorming games back there, usually after the season was over. And it was always a great draw. I'm not sure if that was at Crosley Field, but I know that it was a successful venture. And after that, that helped his exposure in the city. I will say, though, that a lot of people are unaware that Crosley Field was actually the first home field of the Bengals. In 1937, Hal Pennington, who was the owner, founder, and actually coach, and named the team. He actually gave the Bengals their name. Had them play at Crosley Field. My dad said he saw a game there, and he said there was only one problem with playing there, and it was that they have 120 yards stretched out at Crosley Field. 10 of the yards had to be up on the terrace, one of the end. So, well, everybody wanted to go towards the terrace end zone in the fourth quarter. So that only lasted 1 year. Interestingly, in 1938, 39, 40, and 41, which was the Bengals' life back then, they moved to Xavier University and played at Old Xavier Corcoran Field. What happened in that year also, in 38 or early 39, my father was approached by people out of Columbus, and they were actually forming the American Football League, of which not only the Bengals, but a team that my dad ended up being the owner of, which is the Columbus Bullies, were in that league. My dad's team did pretty well. They actually won the league in 39, 40, and 41. And interestingly, my dad actually tried to pull off what would have been the first World Championship game. He knew all these people back then, George Hallis, and they'd play the Bears in preseason games and things. And my dad's team actually in 1940 had the best record in football. They won 8-1-1, and the Bears won 8-3. And he spoke to George Hallis about possibly playing a World Championship game, and he seemed agreeable to it. As a fate would work out, he actually accepted my dad's challenge to play, and he showed me a headline once from the Columbus Dispatch, and it said Bears versus Bullies for World Championship.
That didn't happen.
But that didn't happen because, well, first of all, the Bears played their championship game, and they snuck by the Washington Redskins 73-0. So they had a pretty good team right there. And anyway, George Hallis called my dad afterwards and he said, you know, I thought about that game and we're not going to play you. And he said, why not? He said, well, he said, I think that the Bears have a little bit better team than yours, but you've got a good team and football's a funny game. You fumble the ball, you get an interception, and you could win. And if you win, your team would have instant recognition and your league. If we win, they'll say, so what? He said, I've got everything to lose and nothing to gain. So he declined, but it was a good attempt. The next year,
Didn't you get a little souvenir out of that, Jimmy?
Please?
Didn't your dad get a little souvenir out of that?
That's later on, yeah. In 1943, the Bears won the World Championship again. George Hallis was actually in the Navy, came back, and when the game was over, I think he had several footballs that said 1943 champs on them, and my father was a recipient of one of those. I still have it. It's pretty neat. But anyway, 1941, they won the league again, and they were playing a game on December 7th in Los Angeles, 1941. And something happened at halftime. They said World War II has been declared, that the Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor. So that was the last game for that league. He did tell me that winter he got a phone call from a gentleman named Art Rooney, who was the owner of Pittsburgh Steelers, and he said, Dean, would you like to be a half owner of the Pittsburgh Steelers? And he thanked him and said, thanks for the offer, but he said, I live in Cincinnati and Columbus is 100 miles away, Pittsburgh's about 300 miles away, and frankly, I didn't think I made any money at doing this. 3-4 years of doing this. So he declined, and that's interesting. But the coup de grace on this is that in 1970, early 1970, Hal Pennington, who founded the Bengals, called our house. He asked for my dad. He got on the phone. I said, what's going on? He said, Hal said, Dean, the Bengals are getting sued for their name. He said this person says that he was the owner of the team in 1941 and we did not have the rights to the name of the Bengals, and he wants $50,000 out of court, and if he has to go to court, it'll be $100,000 or more. I told Paul Brown and Mike Brown that the only person in the city that would know if it was or not was you, because you were an owner and you may have the league charter. Do you have it? And my dad said, I do. He said, was this person an owner? He said, no. He said, Mike Brown will be calling you. So Mike Brown called my father. He went down to Riverfront Stadium when it was being built, and he was very glad to see my dad. Made a copy of it and saved the Bengals a lawsuit and much more. So, at any rate, that's a little bit about that. Carrying on to Crosley Field.
Did Mike Brown take your dad out to a pretty swanky restaurant?
Well, actually, what I said was, what did he do for you, Dad? He said, well, I was hoping for a couple of lifetime passes, but what he did was he offered me two seats on the 50-yard line in the upper green. They were good seats. And he ended up going for a couple of years and did that. But I said, anything else? He said, yeah, he took me to Wendy's. And that sounded just like the Browns, but at any rate.
But anyway, I'm interested in when your first Crosley experience was.
My first Crosley experience was when I was 10 years old. Not the first game, but my brother-in-law worked in the scoreboard. He's 12 years older than me. I'm 10 years old, he's 22. He said, I want to take you to Reds game in the scoreboard. I thought, this is pretty cool. So down to the stadium and down to Crosley Field, and walking across the terrace, Joe Nuxall was there, and my brother-in-law introduced me to him. I said, nice to meet you, and all that, and I watched a game from the scoreboard when I was 10. After that, a memory as a fan always stood out. When I was 14, my favorite uncle that lived in Los Angeles, his brother, came to Cincinnati, and we went and saw the Reds play the Dodgers. Always a good game. Well, this game in particular, 10th inning game, 3-3. It's the bottom of the 10th. The bases are loaded. 1 out, and Frank Robinson's up to bat. And sure enough, that first pitch comes in, and Frank swings hard, and he misses it. Next pitch comes in, and another mighty cut, he misses it. And I yell out, Frank, don't try to kill the ball. Just hit a fly ball. We only need a run. The next pitch, he hit it over the top of the scoreboard. It landed on the expressway, and the story was it bounced into somebody's pickup truck, and it landed in Lexington, Kentucky. They called it the longest home run of all time. It might have been anyway, because if you could hit the ball over the top of the scoreboard, that was quite a poke. And that was a pitcher's salvation, too, because they loved the scoreboard, because all those would-be home runs in that ballpark were doubles.
Terrific. Now, how did you end up working in the scoreboard?
Well, again, I'm 16 years old. It's June of 1966, and my brother-in-law calls me. Oh, by the way, the scoreboard people were my brother-in-law, Russ Honroth. The head of the scoreboard was a guy named Bill Birch, Frank Wire, and Bill Brady, and that was the crew. But they were all 12, 13 years older than me. I was the kid, so I was the gopher. Anyway, he said, Jimmy, somebody quit in the scoreboard last night. Do you want to work for the Reds? And the next night, I was there for the next 4 years. So that was interesting. And I might say, to understand the scoreboard, and some of you folks were fortunate enough here that you were in the scoreboard. I know some of you people said it, because I had...
What was the password?
Just knock on the door. What do you mean? Bobby wants to say that I used to kid him that I've got to explain the scoreboard, first of all. Of course, you got 80 feet wide, 60 feet tall, but what the scoreboard covered that nobody could see was a floodgate that had a latch. So there was a gate that you could lift up. So I could let my friends and neighbors in if they felt like coming to the game. And they didn't come that often, but Bobby says that the password was, "I got a six-pack." So,
Now, let me ask, you said operating a scoreboard. All I could think about was putting up the numbers. Is there more to operating that old scoreboard? Because didn't you place those, flip the runs and that type of thing down? How did that
it
operate?
was all, the scoreboard was all manual except for the balls, strikes, and batting average, which there was a, you know, and I ran the scoreboard a number of times too, but, you know, it was electronic for that. But everything else, like the line score of the Reds, that was all put up manually. All the out-of-town games were manual. You'd say, give Detroit 2 runs in the top of the 6th, make it the bottom of the 6th, or whatever the games were, the out-of-town games were going on. It was actually 4 floors. The first was kind of a dirt floor, and I remember walking in, you'd walk across the terrace, there was a little door there, and then the first thing, there was a cove that I could see off to the left. It was the old scoreboard, or the old fence. And I guess in honor of the 61 Yankees that came in and just clobbered the Reds, somebody had scribbled in paint, the M&M boys were here. Of course, that'd be a Mickey Mantle with 55 homers in 61 and Roger Maris with 61. So they had a pretty nice team. But anyway, so that was the first floor, and then there was 4 floors, ladders that went up on each floor, and you know, the top floor was the line score. And we had a Western Union ticker tape there where all the scores would come in, and you could read it off to whoever was running the bottom floor, you know, so you know, keep all the out-of-town scores, you know, up to date. But
Can I interrupt for a second? Mr. Carter, I heard that scoreboard was quite a little hideout for players, would hide out there.
Okay. An interesting story, the end of 66. Depending on who the manager was, if he was not very good and didn't quite know what was going on, which was the first manager that the Reds had that year, his name was Don Hefner. I know you don't know who he is because he was... Anyway, the players would sneak into the scoreboard to BS and smoke cigarettes. And that was all right. So it was the end of 66, and here's Gordy Coleman, remember, and Sammy Ellis, who was a thin pitcher, and it was almost the off season. It was the last week of the season. And Sammy Ellis was lamenting to Gordy Coleman, "Gordy, I'm too skinny. I need to put on some weight. If I don't, I won't be in the major leagues anymore." And Gordy said, "Oh, don't worry, Sammy, that's easy. All you do is you eat French bread, drink a lot of wine, and eat cheese. And you'll gain weight." So we all know Gordy Coleman had a little bit of weight on him. So that was an interesting insight into their off-season diet.
Boy, that announcer from the Dodgers, we used to give you a lot of grief.
Oh, okay. Again, this is kind of chronological. So the opening day of 1967, which really broke my heart because I had to skip a day at Purcell. I didn't miss too much school, but mandated you work opening day. And being the gopher, they told me, "Look, we need the lineups." They were running late. So I went down to get the lineups, Reds dugout, and it was actually Paul Summercamp was there. And Vin Scully, who's a famous announcer for the Dodgers, was still broadcasting at 87 or whatever he is. He was there, and as I was getting to the lineups, he said, "Hey boy," he says, "do you remember that laundry that used to be beyond left field before the expressway was here?" And I went, "Yeah, I believe I remember that." He said, "Do you know why they tore it down?" I said, "No." He said, "Well, the story is that Roy Campanella hit so many home runs off the facing of the laundry, it loosened the bricks, and they had to tear it down." I said, "Okay, Vin." That was opening day. What's next?
Oh, I love that story you tell about an interesting game with Ryan Duran.
Oh, okay.
May of '67.
Yes. And I guess it was the end of May in '67. The Reds were playing the Cardinals, and it was for first place. Things don't change too often, and the Cardinals had a pitcher named Ryan Durham. This guy had thick glasses and could throw the ball very fast, and was a little bit blind. I think the players were a little scared of the ball coming in on it, but he was on that night, and he threw a perfect game for 7 innings. And then it started raining. And it rained, and it rained, and it rained, and the Reds were losing 1-0. They waited about 45, 50 minutes. The rain stopped. Half the fans left. There was hardly anybody left. And lo and behold, Ryan Durham gives up 2 runs in the bottom of the 8th inning. The Reds are winning 2-1. It's the top of the 9th inning. I can't remember who was pitching for the Reds, but Cardinals had players on first and third, nobody out. Orlando Cepeda was on third, and the Reds brought in a pitcher named Don Nottebart. And Don Nottebart threw 1 pitch, and they hit the ball to Leo Cardenas. And Leo Cardenas slipped to third, and he held Orlando Cepeda back. He flipped it to second, out. Threw it to first, out. A Cepeda break for the plate, out. Triple play, end of the game, 1 pitch. So that was a good memory. St. Louis went on that year to win, but interesting.
I understand, Mr. Carter, that you could make some serious money at the ballpark. Is there any truth to that?
Bob is referring to the magnanimous salary that they paid us, which was $6 a game. We would clock in. When the game was over, we went home. But there was a caveat, and that is, if the game went extra innings, you got an extra quarter. Not per inning, a quarter. So here we are. It's the beginning of September that year, and the Reds are in 4th place. The Giants are in 5th. We know they're not going to win the pennant. And the Reds have played this game with the Giants, and it's the 20th inning, and the score is 0-0. Wow. And so it's about 20 after 1 in the morning, and Pete Rose is coming out to left field. And at the scoreboard, there was this big old cutout, you know, where we could see the balls and strikes. But I just yelled out at him, and I said, the Reds were bringing in their worst pitcher. Of course, 21st inning, it's a guy named Bob Lee. Everybody has an awful pitcher. Anyway, I yelled out at Rose, and I said, "Hey, Pete, what do you think?" He said, "We can go home after this inning." He walked in and run. The Reds lost 1-0. Interestingly, my brother-in-law and I were the only ones that were still there that late. It was 1:35 or 1:40 in the morning. He went home, and my sister was waiting up for him. She said, "Where you been? E&B bar?" He said, "No, I was at the ball game." She said, "Baloney." The next morning in the paper, he said I had to get the Enquirer out and show him that the game ended at 1:42 a.m.
And what were you making an inning at that time?
Well, the extra innings, I made 2 cents an inning. So I wasn't overpaid, that's for sure.
That's great. You know what? I heard a real funny story from you one time about Adolfo Phillips.
Yes, this is interesting. Adolfo Phillips was a Chicago Cub. And we know that back in the 60s, Leo DeRocher became the manager of the Cubs. And he announced that year that the Cubs had finished 8th the year before, and he said, "This is not an 8th place team." They finished 10th. So Adolfo Phillips was playing left field one game. I will never forget this because the Reds had the bases loaded. Not everybody played the terrace very well. He was playing left field. And their high fly ball comes to Adolfo Phillips, and he's going back and he's twisting around on the terrace, and he's not sure where the ball is, and it hits him on the head, and it bounces into the screen for a grand slam. So the Reds had some fortune that night. It was, but that was a memorable home run, let's say.
You know, I've always been interested about the different dynamics between the Reds managers and the opposing managers. What was that story about the lineups between Bristol and DeRocher that you remember?
Yeah, the Reds every year when they played the Cubs, they have a Sunday doubleheader across the field. Always got a big crowd. And the Cubs actually did get a little bit better when DeRocher was managing. And I think the Reds had won the first game 7-6. And I was always the gopher. Jimmy, go get the lineups. Jimmy, go do this. Jimmy, go do that. So I'm running into the clubhouse between games, and I got a brilliant idea. I'll get the lineups from Leo DeRocher first, and I'll know who's pitching for Chicago. So I walked in and I said, do you have the lineups for the second game? Leo DeRocher said, who's pitching for Cincinnati? I said, I don't know. He said, go find out. So I went over to the Reds clubhouse, and I don't know why, but Dave Bristol pretty much disrobed between games. I don't know. The guy's sitting there in his underwear eating a sandwich. I said, you got the lineups from the second game. He looked at me, he said, who's pitching for Chicago? I said, I don't know. I said, DeRocher asked me the same thing. I said, I think it's Ferguson Jenkins. He said, I do too. It was Ferguson Jenkins. It didn't matter. Ferguson Jenkins would throw his glove on the mound and he'd beat the Reds every time. He's the last pitcher to win, and it'll never happen again. 20 games for 6 straight years. And this is on a team that wasn't always that good. So that was
Wow. Is there a second part of that with Fergie?
well, Ferguson Jenkins later, I guess he might have seen me around. I became friends with him. The scoreboard had a little arrangement. You got to realize that bottom line is everybody at the ballpark would like to have a baseball. And us, the scoreboard, if they came in, it was a frenzy. But so did the sports service people. And we would walk past third base, out past sports service every night, and they made lemonade and sold lots of beer. And sports service used to count beer bottles, so they weren't getting ripped off, and they'd count lemonade cups. They didn't count beer cups. So sports service would give us all the free lemonade we wanted in beer cups. So one of my missions as the gopher also was every night, Jimmy, bring out the lemonades. So one night I'm going out to third base and I'm getting out to the gate that took us across the terrace. I had 10 lemonades there, and Ferguson Jenkins says, hey, what you got there? I says, no, we get lemonade every night. He said, and then if we got a scrub ball, we would give it to sports service. You know, they'd get a ball a week or something, and they liked it. Nobody was out except sports service, I guess. But he said, boy, I'd love to have one of those. Now, if you remember back at Crosley Field, the pitching bullpen existed of a little bench that about 8 or 10 people could maybe sit on. That was it, and a little spot to warm up. Ferguson Jenkins said, look, I'll make you a deal. If you leave a lemonade here at the end of the bench, at the end of this, every night you will find a baseball at front of the scoreboard where you can go in. I said, you got a deal. So that went on for a couple of years. It was a wonderful thing. I loved it when the Cubs came to town because Fergie Jenkins and I were buddies.
That was a wonderful story, Jimmy. And now on a more serious note, didn't you have a little interesting run-in with the general manager, Dick Wagner?
Actually, Dick Wagner was the stadium operations person. He and Bob Housen came over together from St. Louis, and Dick Wagner was kind of a tough guy, okay? He wasn't the friendliest person. And at any rate, he introduced the walkie-talkie to stadium operations, and, you know, he was on top of everything. Well, back in the day, the ushers for the Reds wore these straw barbershop quartet type hats. They all had to wear them. But they also sold these hats to fans. But they cost like $6 a piece back in the 60s. It was like, most people didn't buy it. Well, I always would come out the scoreboard about, the games were at 8:05, but I'd be going out, you know.
That lemonade?
This
is a true sports service lemonade. You see it's water and they waved a lemon over it.
That's going to go down. Okay.
Anyway, so it's 10 till 7 or something like that. I'm going out third base, and here's Dick Wagner, and there's a couple of guys sitting up at about the 15th row, up in, you know, left field stands, and they, big guys, and they had on these straw hats. And I'm watching, and Dick Wagner bolts up the steps, grabs this guy, and he says, "You're fired!" This guy says, "Who are you?" And he pushes him, and they get in this scuffle, and beer's flying, and everybody, oh man, we loved it because Dick Wagner was not, let's say, everybody's favorite person. You know, he's in a scuffle with the fan. Wow. So what happened is a couple of nights later, the ushers still wore these straw hats, but they all had a sticker on them. They said, "Usher."
Oh, I love that story you tell about the '69 Miracle Mets and the pranksters on that team.
Yeah, the Mets actually had a good team in '69, so did the Cubs for that matter. But the Mets were in town. They had a southern prankster, left-hander. The guy's name was Jerry Koosman. Anyway, he decided he wanted to see what was going on the scoreboard, and he walked up. He's the only player I knew that walked up the steps and the whole 9 yards. And the lemonades had nice ice chunks in them. Okay. He says, "Hey, you got some ice chunks in there." Okay. He said, I'd like to have one. I got my pitching coach out there. His name's Rube Walker. And I just want to see if I can maybe fling this ice cube and see if I can hit him. He throws this ice, and he hits him right in the back of the head. Rube Walker flips around. "What's that?" You know, then he turns around, he throws another piece of ice, he hits him again. He turns around, he says, "Koosman, are you up there somewhere?" He knew what it was. So that was pitching out of throwing ice out of the scoreboard.
Speaking of throwing, did you ever have any ball players throw balls through that little box out there?
Yeah, this is an interesting. Okay, if you were to be on the scoreboard at Crosley Field, there was a cutout. It was, out that far, maybe like that. Okay. 1969 was the first year of division play. There was West and East. And going into the last week of the season, about 4 teams had a chance to win the division. The Reds were one of them. The Braves won by like a game or something. But the Astros, with 3 games to go, they were eliminated. They lost. They were out of it. And I was down there early, as I always was. And as I said, we kind of lived for baseball. And I was kind of ornery back in the day. So I yelled out, "Here were the Astros pitchers," mulling around on the terrace in the outfield. And I yelled out, and I said, you know why you guys got eliminated? I said, I bet not a single one of you could throw a ball in this square. I stuck my head out, and a ball came in. And I stuck my head out, and another ball came in. When they got done, 10 balls were in the scoreboard. And the phone rang. I picked it up. Scoreboard. This is Dick Wagner. What's going on out there? I said, I don't know. The Astros are just throwing balls in the scoreboard. He said, tell them to quit it. I said, yes, sir.
That was beautiful, Jimmy.
Truth.
You and Sparky were quite the buds. Tell us about your wonderful experience of working with Sparky.
Well, to understand how Sparky became the manager, in '69, the Reds manager was Dave Bristol. And the scuttlebutt was that Housen and the Reds were trying to trade Lee May. And apparently Dave Bristol said to them, you're not trading Lee May or anyone on this team. This team's going to win the pennant. So they didn't think Dave Bristol was exactly the company man they wanted. And so they got Sparky Anderson to be the manager. They still tried to trade Lee May, but they didn't get the trade that they wanted. So here's Sparky Anderson, who had never managed in the major leagues. He actually managed the San Diego Padres as a third base coach for 1 year, and had managed in the minors. But he's 35 years old. And they said, do you want to be the manager of the Cincinnati Reds? He must have thought he had died and gone to heaven. So here he is, and Dave Bristol was absolutely right. This team's going to win a pennant. So it's about the 7th of June. There's about 2 weeks left at Crosley Field. And again, we don't have the lineups. And they said, Jimmy, go down to the dugout and get the lineups. You got to realize at the time, the Reds are about 40 wins and 15 losses, or about 12 games in first place. And I go up to Sparky and I said, do you have the lineups for tonight's game? And he looks at me and he says, Jimmy, that's what I don't understand. They're the same as every night. He said, you see, all I do is I write these names down in order and we win. Rose, Tolan, Perez, Bench, May, Helms, Carbo. He had a team that led the league in offense and defense. And Lee May held up his own. He had 34 home runs that year. Perez had 40, and Pep, and I believe Bench at 42. So pretty hard to lose with that team. So that was, they had a good team.
On a sad note, what was the last day at Crosley like?
Well, the last day wasn't sad, but the last day was, they played the Giants. It was a close game, and in the bottom of the 8th inning, Lee May did what he did many times. He got a big hit, drove in a run, and the Reds won, came from behind and won 5-4. That was the last game at Crosley.
I understand it was a big adjustment for you when you moved to Riverfront Stadium.
Yes. I did work at Riverfront Stadium for the balance of that year. And what happened at Riverfront was that the 5 guys in the scoreboard were no longer necessary. They needed one guy behind home plate, who was Bill Burge. Although I ended up being the backup guy for him, and I'll explain that in a bit. But anyway, the first night at Riverfront, they said, we need somebody to put the flags on in the top of the stadium. We want you to go up there with somebody else. And I said, wow, so what are we doing? He says, well, we got the pennants in order, the standings, Reds, Dodgers, Giants, whatever it was, those 6 teams, the other 6 for the East. And then there's 20 American flags we want you to hang up. So I get up there with this other fella, and they said, don't worry, there's a guardrail and a catwalk, but there's a guardrail up there and you'll be fine. Well, the stadium was not yet finished. So we got up on the top of the stadium. It was a little windy out, and there was a catwalk about this big, and there were no guardrails. And I'm kind of clumsy. And I kept thinking, I'm going to trip. I'm going to end up on the concourse of the stadium the first night. But we slowly walked around the stadium and put up all the flags on the stadium. And then we got back down. And the person that sent us up there, he says, well, how'd it go? Did you get it finished? And I says, we didn't get it finished. I said, I have one request. He said, what's that? And I said, I don't want to ever go up there again. I never did.
Oh, I know Chicago, Wrigley Field is a favorite spot for you. Tell us about one of your visits.
Okay. Now, again, this is about a month after, this is about August of 1970. And I had a good friend named Eddie Trotta who hadn't much been out of town. And I said, Eddie, why don't we go to Chicago and watch the Reds play at Wrigley Field? And he said, well, how are we going to get there? I had stuck my thumb out a few times and gone on some trips in the past, and I said, oh, that's simple. We'll get a cardboard piece, a piece of cardboard, we'll write Chicago on it, we'll stand out on I-74, we'll stick our thumb out, and a truck driver will pick us up. And no problem, will ride us to Chicago. Well, lo and behold, his mother got us out there on I-74 about 7 in the morning, 7:15 in the morning, stuck our thumb out, got a truck driver picked us up, and he drove us to about 1 mile from Wrigley Field. Now, on the way though, Eddie said, my mother's going to worry. She's going to wonder if I'm safe. And I said, I'll tell you what.
Had he ever been out of town before?
I don't know. He'd probably been out of town on a couple softball tournaments or something, but I don't think he ever went to the big city. I don't know that. Anyway, so I said, don't worry, Eddie, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'm going to write a note. I'm going to make sure that the Reds announcers get it, and then they'll announce it on the radio that we're at the game, and your mom will know we're safe. He said, good idea. So I wrote this little note out, and I had it all ready for me. But we got to the ballpark, and it was already the top of the first inning. And anybody that knows Wrigley Field knows there's a lower deck, and then there's a rickety old press row, and then there's a second deck. So I go up to the press row, and there's a, Chicago Cubs guard there. And I said, hey, I wonder if you could do us a favor. I said, we're from Cincinnati. Could you deliver this note to the Reds announcer? And he said, no. He said, the game's in progress, and frankly, you're not allowed on this press row anyway, so you just need to leave. And I said, okay. So he turned around and went off to the right. I opened the gate, and I opened it and started walking down press row toward where it said visitor and announcers. But the guard caught up with me, grabbed me on the arm, and he said, I told you you can't be on press row. I said, I'll tell you what. If the announcers know me, they'll greet me. If they don't, throw me out of the park. He said, okay. I opened the door, and Joe Nuxall said, hey, Jimmy, how you doing? So lo and behold, here I am sitting with Joe Nuxall and Jim McIntyre for an inning. And it was great. And then Joe Nuxall, I'm sitting next to him, and he says, hey, we got a visitor up here in the scoreboard, up at Wrigley Field. It's the old scoreboard from Crosby Field, Jimmy Carter. And he said his brother Eddie Trotta's up here at the game with him. And of course his mother heard it, and she knew that I had her little boy safe. that was great fun.
These are great stories, but I've always wondered, you had just related how you slipped into press row. Have you ever tried that slipping into any other big venues, say like a Rolling Stones concert or anything? Yeah, we'd love to hear that.
Okay. I'll diverge on this one story, and then we'll finish up Crosley Field or Riverfront Stadium. But now I'm going up to about 1978, and I'm actually in California. And my good friend Duke McGonigal, I had visited him down in Santa Barbara, and he gave me a piece of a newspaper that I had lost. And this is another story, but in 1976, I went up to Rosalind Carter, and I said, "Hi, my name's Jimmy Carter, too." And she said, "It is. That makes me feel like I'm back home in Georgia." And lo and behold, some photographer for the Empire took the picture. And the next day, it was a month before the general election, it said, "Hello, I'm Jimmy Carter," and it said, "Mrs. Carter met somebody that she never thought she'd meet, Jimmy Carter." Well, I'm out in California, and Duke said, "Do you have this?" And I said, "No, I lost that. You got a copy for me, Duke?" He gives me a copy. Now, ironically, Joe Welmers here had also given me something. He had a ticket that said 1965 World Series, which the Reds didn't get in. So here I go on, I think it was Mick Jagger's birthday in '78. It was a hot August afternoon. It was like a Wednesday or something. And it was his birthday. And the place is sold out. It's Oakland Alameda Coliseum. There's 50,000 people there to see the Rolling Stones. And I go up to one gate and I tried Joe's ticket. I said, "Ticket," and I gave him this World Series ticket and went, "Nice try." He sent me away. But I always thought, when in doubt, go to the press gate. So I go to the press gate, and there's people there that look nice, no turnstile or whatever. I walk up to this beautiful gal in a white flowing dress, and I said, "You know that old saying that if the president showed up, you'd let him in?" And I said, "Well, my name's Jimmy Carter, and I know the president." And I showed a picture of Rosalind Carter. I gave her this picture of Rosalind Carter with me. She said, "Wait a minute." She walks around, talks to somebody behind her. She comes back to me and she says, "Are you with Peter Tosh?" "And not on the list." I said, "Yes." She stamped my hand and said, "Go right through here." She sent me into the celebrity section. I sat about 2 rows from Eddie Money. I'm right next to the stage for the next 5 hours. These people kept looking and saying, "Who is this guy?" It was a wonderful afternoon. But,
Oh, that was heartwarming. Do you want to go back and finish up Crosley Field
yeah,
or
I
the
just
Riverfront
wanna say
Stadium?
Riverfront Stadium.
Okay.
The way I did end up, Bill Birch had runs and offs with the Reds. Anyway, I ended up working quite a few games behind the home plate, which was nice. One game of note was I worked the 3rd game of the pennant series, and the Reds won, so the Reds beat the Pirates to win the pennant. And then actually the last game I worked for the Reds was the 2nd game of the World Series when they played the Baltimore Orioles. So that's kind of a good way to, wind up, So as Joe Nuxall might say, I'm brown and 30, headed for home or whatever.
I know that your long history as a hardworking American included some journeys as a repossession person. Would you love to tell that story where you were repossessing?
I don't want to embarrass anybody else that's present, but in 1970, besides working for the Reds, I also had a job that Mr. Duke McGonigal and I got off the UC job board, and we actually were repossessors for Sears and Roebuck. And Sears and Roebuck would tell us to get a rental truck because they didn't want anybody to know coming up to their house that we're the repossessors. We're not going to say Sears, and they're going to hide out. So we had our truck. But I think the one he's talking about of note was we had, I believe, a washer and dryer or something to pick up in Kennedy Heights. And we checked it out initially. We saw that in this person's basement, there's the washer. We came up, we knocked on the door, and a person came to the door. And we said, yes, you're behind on your Sears payments, and we'd just like a payment. A payment, or else, they would like us to get the merchandise. He said, you folks need to get away from the door. My wife has a shotgun pointed at you, and I suggest you leave. So Duke looks at him and pipes up, oh yeah? Well, we got a little something in the truck too. I looked up and said, we do, Duke? So, anyway, lo and behold, we walked back to the truck, and he said, why did you say that? I said, Duke, that's a job for the sheriff, and I'm not dying for Sears and Roebuck for $2.25 an hour. But that was that 1970. To give you an idea, on my 21st birthday, I worked the whole day on September 21st. I worked the whole day repossessing with Duke, and then the Reds had a night game, so I worked till 11 o'clock, and about 11:30 I went up and celebrated my birthday by having a drink at New Dilly's and said, you're 21, that was it. So, yeah.
I wonder if anybody has any questions for you of any type of a nature, personal nature or of a sports nature.
Just out of curiosity, how did they communicate hits and errors to you so you could put them on the scoreboard?
Oh, well, I must say that we found out our information the same one that everybody else did. We listened to Joe Nuxall on the radio.
Makes sense.
But seriously,
Yeah.
that was it, We could see the umpire sometimes, and it sure helped to have the announcers on the radio so that we knew what the heck was going on. It was a little far out,
Well, that reminds me, we don't want to get into any controversy here, but what about the 60 Reds in the telephone scandal?
Well,
Go on, Jimmy.
I have to admit, I was not there. So, but in 1960, 1960, the Reds weren't very good. They finished 27 games out of first. They were in 7th place. And in 1961, they started off okay, but then they had a long losing streak, and they were 5-10 part of the way through April. And the story I heard from my others in the scoreboard, I walked into the scoreboard the first night, and there were 2 phones there. One worked and one didn't, and I said, what's the dead phone for? And they said, don't worry about it. But finally they said, you remember in 61, the Reds won? Yeah. Well, they had some help in the season. They had an old pitcher that helped pick off signals. We said, how did it work? And he said, well, he'd peer in, and he could see if the pitcher was saying 1 for fastball or 2 for something else, or whatever the other signal was. And Hutchinson had a little thing in his ear. Everybody thought he was deaf in his left ear. No, that was a connection. So all it was said was 1 or 2. But if he said 1, and Frank Robinson was up at bat, the third base coach would scratch his nose or something, and he'd say, come on, Frank, get a hit. Come on, hit one, Frankie. But if it was anything else, they'd call their last name. Come on, Robinson, Pinson, Bell, Post. The Reds, the numbers, they got a lot better. It was kind of funny though. I actually looked back over the records on that year, and that helped them for a while. But when the season ended, actually they had the exact same record on the road as they did at home. So they actually, but it didn't hurt. Their averages were a lot better. And the next year though, the National League expanded, and the pitchers that they lost in the Kraft, J. Hook, and Sherman Roebuck Jones, and all those names. They, Reds are team, you know, so it ended. I do think it was funny, in 1967 or 8, the Phillies were in town, and the Reds had won the first 3 games, and their catcher was a guy named Clay Dalrymple. And he came out on a Sunday, and the Reds had beat the Phillies 3 straight. He came and said, he came to the scoreboard, he said, "You guys picking our signals off?" And I said, "No." He says, "Yeah, I heard you were picking signals off." I said, no, that's long ago and far away." And he said, "Well, you beat us 3 straight. How do you explain that?" And I said, "Clay, you need to look in the newspaper." I said, "The Phillies are in last place." There's a reason.
Oh.
So at any rate.
Now, Jimmy, did you have I don't know if it was a shouting match, but some words with Alex Johnson through the scoreboard one time?
Alex Johnson could have been the laziest outfielder I've ever seen. But he could hit, but he refused to take batting practice. He would stand in the outfield in batting practice like this, and if the ball came to the right of him, he wouldn't move. If it went to the left of him, he wouldn't move. If it came straight to him, he'd pick it up, and he'd throw it back. He couldn't field worth a lick. He could hit, though. And he was one of the first people to benefit from the designated hitter in the American League, because they traded the American League, and he gets hit. And he couldn't field. So I'd yell at him and say, whatever. I used to converse with Alex Johnson occasionally. I wasn't his favorite fan, that's for sure. So,
Jimmy, how deep was the score?
how deep? Well,
Is it a narrow?
I think it's about 80 feet wide by about 60 feet high. And, you know, like I said, they don't run
No,
over.
how thick was it to walk around in?
It was like about from there, here to about here.
So 8-10 feet is narrow and dark?
Yeah, it was fairly narrow, and there were cross beams, and there were steel cross beams.
I hear a blind guy could get around better than you could.
The scuttlebutt, besides some of the people here, is I had a good friend named Jim Tudor that was blind, and he said, "I want to go to a game with the scoreboard too." So one night, I brought him into the scoreboard. Well, these blind guys, amazing, they adapt, and he climbed up the ladder okay, and I was always running around like some kind of banshee, and bam, my head in, and these steel beams. These guys said, "You brought a blind guy in the scoreboard, and he gets around better than you do."
Jimmy, how big were the numbers that you would put through the slot and they would go out?
Oh, they were-
were.
Yeah, you know, that big, you know. I'll tell you, it's funny, now that you've already exposed the pitching scout, I had to tell you, this is funny. Years later, I'm working for Sprint. I'm living in Chicago. I'm Sprint sales manager for Chicago and Milwaukee. And they sent me to a Chamber of Commerce luncheon at Arlington Heights. And I ended up, lo and behold, sitting next to a guy who told me that he played for the '61 Chicago Cubs. He told me he was also a cousin of Ken Boyer and Clete Boyer, who, you know, Kenny Boyer's in the Hall of Fame. Oh, okay. And I told him the story about how the Reds got a lot better in '61, and he said, "You know, we knew the Reds would cheat that year." He said, "No team got that much better in 1 year." He said, "You know, we cheated them back at Wrigley Field," and he said it was easier than what you did, almost the same thing. I said, "Really?" He said, "By the way," he said, "we finished in last place that year, and we were the only team to beat the Reds in the season series." And I looked it up, and he was right. And I looked up the scores, and 19-6 and 14-5. I mean, they clobbered him. I said, "What'd you do?" He said, "We had a pitcher that broke his arm. He had a white plaster cast. We told him to go out to the Wrigley Field scoreboard. What are you going to do?" "Same thing. I'm going to peer in." "Okay. And what did you do?" He said, "All we told him to do was, on one of those out-of-town games where they had the little slots that went up and down, we're going to look at this one slot. And if we see that white dot of plaster, we know it's a fastball. And if we don't see snot. And we clobbered him, and Hutchinson was so mad, he was a hothead. He was breaking chairs in the clubhouse. He thought we had the exit on and off lights going on. He didn't know what the hell we were doing. But he said we beat their brains and we cheated them back. He said, he went on and said, what other one was good? He said, we were playing in Milwaukee. He says, the Braves were good. Lawrence Bond, Lou Burdett. They didn't pitch every day. He says, we were playing there one day, and there's a couple guys dead center, and they're out there, they're drinking beer or something. And the umpire walked out and looked at him, and he said, out of here. He says, Lou Burdett and Lawrence Bond picking signals at County Stadium, Municipal Stadium in Milwaukee. So,
You know, I hate to change the subject, but didn't you run into that host for Jeopardy one time? And
oh, okay. This is funny. It wasn't Jeopardy. If you guys remember back in the day, there was Hollywood Squares with Peter Marshall. And this friend of mine said, did you see that Hollywood Squares? I have a friend named Bob Young. He says, do you see what happened the other night? He says, Peter Marshall had a guy come on from Columbus. And he said, he asked him, he says, you're from Columbus, Ohio. He says, are you a Buckeye fan? And he says, oh, I love the Buckeyes. They're the greatest. He said, he looked at him and said, do you know what a Buckeye is? He said, no. He says, it's a hairless nut of no commercial worth. I said, come on, Bob. He didn't say that. Yeah, he did. Well, as fate would have it, in 1980, Sprint had me transferred to Kansas City for about 4 months. The Kansas City Royals win the pennant. They're in the World Series. I'm down at the Hyatt Regency. And lo and behold, there's a player on the Kansas City Royals named Pete LeCoq. He happens to be Peter Marshall's son. And here's Peter Marshall sitting up at the bar with this big Royals jacket on, and I couldn't help it. I had to go up and say, I've admired Hollywood Squares for many years and all this kind of stuff. But he said, I have to ask you this. Did you say this? He said, I swear to God, I never said that. That is not true. I said, okay. But I do remember Hollywood Squares back in the day, because I always thought it was so funny. These people are sitting there, they're playing tic-tac-toe, and the squares are 9 feet tall. I mean, it's pretty hard to screw up, but they would all the time. And Peter Marshall would go, well, I would have gone to Charlie Weaver for the win, but this may work out. Or Paul Wendt or whoever else. So that was.
Now, Jimmy, I think the Reds should invite you. I heard during All-Star Week, they're going to have a special ceremony at the site of the old Crosby Field. I think they have a mural there, and they have the exact spot or something, and they're going to have some kind of honorary ceremony, and maybe we need to look into seeing.
I don't know. I've been down there. It's Phillips Supply Company. I've seen the spot and all that.
well, Jimmy, as an ending note, we all know that you've been one of the great salesmen in telecommunications, and now you're retired. But remember the time you were the sales manager in Chicago, and you got kind of run out?
No, you know what? I want to finish up with a little Sprint story.
Okay.
About, in 1979, I got hired by Sprint, and lo and behold, I had a sports writer that signed up. Nobody knew about us for 5 years. It was all word of mouth. And he said, I know somebody that has a terrible phone bill. His name is Ken Griffey. So he gave me his phone number, and I called him up, and he had like a $250 phone bill a month. And I said, here, dial these digits, and you'll drop your bill by about 75% with all these credit card calls and all this stuff on it. So I came back to the office. I had a really neat boss. His name was Joe Hayden. I said, you won't believe who I signed up? He said, who? I said, Ken Griffey. He looked at me and said, what about the rest of the team? I said, okay. So I called Griffey up and I said, what about the rest of the team? He says, you need to talk to John McNamara. He's the manager. Well, how do I get a hold of him? He said, call down to the stadium, ask for him. I called down John McNamara. They put me right through. I said, this is a great deal. Drop your day bill, 75% versus what you're paying on credit card calls. You had to go to the operator and all that jazz. And he said, what are you doing on Friday night? I said, I don't know. He says, well, come on down to the stadium. He said, we're playing St. Louis. So they let me come into Riverfront Stadium, which says no National League personnel beyond this point. And walked in with another guy, and, Johnny Bench, Joe Morgan, George Foster, John McNamara, Bertie Stowe, and Griffey were all became, Sprint customers of mine. That was kind of fun. So I know that after knowing that Pete Rose, Tony Perez, Johnny Bench, Rose, Perez, and Concepcion was actually a rookie on the 61 or the 70 team. He was on the team. And then those three of the what they call the Big Eight or the Great Eight or whatever. The only one I never knew or met was Toronto. Caesar Toronto. So that's kind of neat. But yeah.
Well, it's been delightful listening to your yarns that you spin so artfully. And with that, we'd like to close this with Joe and the Lord's Prayer. No, I'm kidding.
Yes.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, Rob.
I think you guys should repeat, you played at Crosley Field, right, in 6